I also want to say my condolences to those who were close to Rolf Husfeld, whom I didn't know, but his absence is felt even for me. So, yeah, let me start with my presentation. And indeed, my presentation moves on a little bit to the popular memory of the First World War. I'm a memory scholar that deals, a sociologist, memory scholar that deals with the cinematic memory predominantly. So my presentation has 3 parts. Next slide, please. The first part is connecting European and Middle East memory of the Great War. The second, Aljazeera English, who has to be distinguished from Aljazeera Arabic, as a new actor in this field. And finally, which historical patterns are used to frame the memory of the First World War in these documentaries. So next slide, please. Okay, next. Yes. So what I do in this book, which is going to appear in 3 weeks from now, actually, it's not out yet, connects to what was said in the keynote yesterday. That is connecting European and Middle East memory, that the Great War is remembered in Europe as the great seminal catastrophe, as George Cannon has put it, the American diplomat. It was mentioned in the keynote. And my question, if you want, is how is this notion also detectable in the movies and documentaries that deal with the Middle East? And as a memory scholar, I think we should be very well aware that this term or phrase that George F. Cannon used was coined at the late 1970s in his book about the decline of the Bismarck's world order. And it is indeed a term that looks back on this violent history, but is informed also through the Second World War very strongly, and the Holocaust. So the memory, the language of memory that Cannon applies here is, of course, a memory that is coined through the short 20th century, if you want to use the term of Hobsbawm. Next slide, please. And next, and it is a way of remembering suffering through wartime that has a language of its own, or a language that became dominant, let's say. Next slide, please. And this language, the methodological approach that I use to investigate this memory is termed cultural trauma. That's an approach that was coined by Jeffrey C. Alexander and others. Next. And a cultural trauma is a kind of a marker that connects a traumatic or an event in the past with its lasting effects for the present. So, and I will give you a short example for such a cultural trauma, because my main claim will be, or the comparison will be, how do the construction of the great seminal catastrophe differs in Europe from those from the one in the Middle East. So next slide, please. And an example for such an element that contributes to a cultural trauma is a sequential trauma. A sequential trauma is basically something that actually occurs after the violence was acted out and has to do with, let's say, the denial, the term that was used now in the lecture before me. A sequential trauma occurs when a violence is denied to the acknowledgement is denied, and it creates a trauma in its own right. And the most prominent example for this is, of course, among others, but the Armenian genocide. So next slide, please. A new development, if you want, during the centenary was the amount of films that dealt with the Armenian genocide. And I gave a presentation about this subject in Haifa with Stefan, actually. This is an example, of course, for how a trauma and a sequential trauma is built, especially in the film 1915, which you see here the poster of, that deals with the Armenian memory and the denial and what it does to the Armenian community here, mainly in the US. But this structure is very palpable in these films. I spoke about, and I wanted to mention these productions because it's part of my research in the book. And if you compare, for instance, these movies of The Promise and The Ottoman Lieutenant, you can clearly see that the struggle for hegemony, how the Armenian genocide is perceived, is far from over. And I wanted to mention that briefly as a part of what my real research deals with. The Aljazeera productions that I will speak about now also touch upon the Armenian genocide, but there you can, maybe not surprisingly, see that the G word is avoided, probably due to the importance of the Turkish market for Al Jazeera. So we can speak about that later, but I just wanted to mention it at this point. Next slide, please. Right, so Aljazeera English produced 3 documentaries during the centenary. 2 of them are event-related, the Balfour Declaration, Lines in the Sand, that deal with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the flagship production of the channel was a World War I Through Arab Eyes, which is a TV miniseries with 3 episodes. And these productions are also still available both on the homepage of Al Jazeera and on YouTube. You can easily find them if you want to look them up. Maybe as a as a background to Al Jazeera, I mentioned in the beginning that we have to distinguish Al Jazeera Arabic from Al Jazeera English. There is a political struggle about Al Jazeera in particular that started already in 1969 when the channel was established. Both Saudi Arabia and Egypt had an interest to shut down this channel, and this is an ongoing political conflict because of the programming of Al Jazeera, who came up with a new media concept that was, in a way, foreign to the region, and propagated to show all sides of a conflict in the news. And my scientific question was if this approach, that was also, of course, transferred to the English channel that was founded in 2006. My scientific question was, is this multi-perspective approach also applied to the historical documentaries, and here in particular to the First World War and the consequences of it? Because what all of these three documentaries do is they not only show you the past, they also they move to the present. Because of the political problems in the region, the First World War is indeed understood as a seminal point for these political problems, and all documentaries connect very strongly the past with the present. So next slide, please. Right. I will focus in my presentation now on the flagship production, if you want, also due to time limitations, of course. And this flagship production, World War I Through Arab Eyes, consists of 3 episodes: the Arabs, the Ottomans, and the modern, the new Middle East. I will show one sequence from this production so that you also get a visual impression. But the main point here is what I mentioned in the beginning. So I will try to identify the historical elements that contribute to the understanding of a trauma of the First World War. So if you want to have a slight comparison, if we speak about the seminal catastrophe in Europe, we have a certain image in mind, these images that you also saw at the beginning of my presentation, you know, the senseless dying of soldiers, etc. And what I wanted to what I focused on was also what are the elements, the historical elements that are brought forward in the Al Jazeera documentaries, and how do they differ to the European picture of the Great War and the seminal catastrophe. That's also another research question that made up this attempt to connect Middle Eastern and European memory. And I thought also Stefan showed this in the morning in his lecture, that a kind of connection historically is very strong, but in the popular memory, we hardly find it. So that was part of my project. And please, next slide. This is what next. This is what I'm now going to talk about. Let me shortly look at the time if I'm still okay. Okay. So I will mention these historical elements that are presented in these documentaries, and particular in World War I through Arab eyes. The first is, not surprisingly, I guess, the immense civilian suffering in the Ottoman Empire that is largely unknown, I guess, to a European audience, but is of course, significant part of the memory in the region, among them the Great Famine in Syria and the locust plague that went along with it. So this is one topic that is mentioned in the documentary. The second element that is also that you already see here on the slide is the forced recruitment by the imperial powers, and this element plays a crucial role in the documentary. Arabs were forced into a war that was not theirs. This relates mainly to the French and English imperial powers and their recruitment strategies in North Africa, India, and other parts of the colonial empires. The forced recruitment meant that Muslims had to fight fellow Muslims. That's how it's phrased in the documentary. Although forced recruitment also occurred in the Ottoman army, I think it's fair to say that the recruitment that was also painful for especially the people in many Arab countries is not perceived as strongly as the forced recruitment by the imperial powers. That's also a way that how it is portrayed in this documentary. Third slide, please.
Tunisians were first conscripted into...
Go on. Sorry, I cannot show you this sequence because otherwise we will not make it in time. The third element of a cultural trauma is, of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and its broken Allied promises. I will not elaborate on this because I think it's rather clear to everybody. And the point that I want now to focus on a little bit more, also because I know the context of the conference, and Müjema, the speaker before me, I think it fits very well into the setting now of our discussion and the conference discussion, is the Turkish-Arab divide that is an element of a cultural trauma in this documentary. So the abolition of the caliphate by Mustafa al-Kemal in 1924 and the emergence of nation states under imperial influence and control. The abolition of the caliphate signifies a divide between Turks and Arabs that remain relevant for regional policies or politics. It harkens back to Kemal Pasha's hard regime in Greater Syria and the execution of Arab intellectuals in Beirut and Damascus in May 1916. The executions are widely regarded as a turning point between Turks and Arabs and the beginning of the end of a shared Ottoman identity. These subjects play a crucial role in the second episode of the documentary. Now I will show you a short scene to give you an idea how the documentary, the TV miniseries is done and how this topic is put in place. Please play the movie.
The Treaty of Sèvres near Paris in August 1920 laid out the Allies' harsh post-war terms. The Turks turned to the hero of Gallipoli, the army officer who led the Ottoman defeat of the Allies in the Dardanelles in 1915.
The conditions the Treaty of Sèvres placed on the Ottoman Empire were extreme. So extreme that Kemal Atatürk and the Turkish nation would refuse them and repel 5 invading European armies.
Mustafa Kemal managed to command the Turks to victory in what became the Turkish War of Independence.
لا شك أن هذا جعل مصطفى كمال معجزة أمام الأتراك. بعبقرية مصطفى كمال استطاع أن يوحد تركيا وأن يجعلها دولة واحدة، وأجبر الدول الغربية على الاعتراف باستقلال تركيا وبوحدتها الجغرافية والسياسية عام 1923. بعدها ألغى السلطنة، ثم ألغى الخلافة بعدها بعام سنة 1924، ومنذ إذن بدأ بحملته الإصلاحية، أي بتخليص تركيا من طابعها الإسلامي الذي أثار حفيظة العرب والمسلمين في جميع أنحاء العالم.
With the bond between Arab and Turk now broken, Mustafa Kemal and the independent Turkish state turned their backs not only on their own past, but on the Arab peoples as a whole. The Arabs were now on their own.
When it becomes clear.
So I think this scene illustrates very vividly this kind of both the heroification of Atatürk in the Arab memory. There are also scenes where he is likened to Khalid ibn al-Wahid, a companion of Muhammad who founded the caliphate. So he becomes a hero, of course, in the Arab memory for his victory against the colonial powers. But on the other side, there is this abandonment and this feeling of a divide. And I found this very interesting, again, as a part of a traumatic experience that is put forward in this documentary. And we all know that this divide is still very much there. If we look at Erdogan and his approach to the region and these kind of political ramifications are still very vivid. And I thought it's very interesting to see that it is situated back in this historical period through this documentary. Now, the last element of the cultural trauma that I could identify in this documentary goes to another subject. Please slide. And that is the Balfour Declaration and the Zionist movement and the foundation of Israel. So in the third episode, the documentary uses actually an anti-Zionist narrative to fast forward to the present. The voiceover states, quote, "The Arab world could not unite to prevent the state of Israel becoming a reality in the heart of the Arab world," end of quote. The harsh condemnation of the Zionist project that came about with British support now coincides with the founding of the State of Israel as a catastrophic event for the region. A series of images and scenes from more recent conflicts follow, suggesting the present-day problems have their origin in the establishment of the Jewish state. So this is the fifth element that can be identified. And now let me just sum up this kind of great seminal catastrophe. As you see here on this slide, we have 5 historical points that logically differ very much from the European context. But in a way, the language of remembrance is not very far apart if we would compare it to let's say, an art documentary that deals with the with the European memory of the Great War, we could see that the language of the cinematic language and the language of memory would be quite familiar, of course, with a different historical context. So I sum up. The elements of civilian suffering, forced recruitment by colonial powers that made Muslim fight fellow Muslims, and the demise of the Ottoman Empire, which left millions of Arabs under English and French rule, are marked as breaking points in the historical understanding of this period. Therefore, the Great War and the treaties that follows are coded as foundational cultural trauma. This coding appeals to the formation of a transnational Muslim-Arab identity for an international audience. This is the target audience for the Aljazeera English channel. So while the documentaries introduce a multi-perspective approach, and I could not show you this now in greater detail due to the limitations of time, it does indeed show when it comes to the understanding of present day's realities, there is a more multi-perspective approach involved, about which we can maybe talk now in the discussion. So this is something that really happens, especially this is especially applied when it comes to the depiction of the modern Middle East with its ongoing conflicts. Still, a preferred pan-Arab narrative can be identified. Given the target audience of the channel, this is hardly surprising. What is at stake here, and this is my last remark, what is at stake here in a wider sense is the nation form as the hegemonial form of political self-governance. The nation state was introduced to the region as a predominantly colonial form of ruling. Looking back at the First World War and the demise of the Ottoman Empire brings back this crucial junction for the development of the modern Middle East. The Al Jazeera documentaries do contribute to this task, but lack at certain points when it comes to the Armenian genocide or also the creation of, I think, Israel, points at they lack at certain points a critical evaluation of the historical content. So that's my presentation, and now I'm very curious about comments and criticism.
Yes, thank you, Michael, for this presentation. Actually, we could not see every clip, so maybe, yeah, that's the reality, I mean, of the time. Yeah, but you give us an impression of what's going on there. So maybe I look in the chat. Okay, there are no questions. So please, if you are live streaming this, you can always ask the questions in the chat. And of course, here in the audience in the European Academy too. So just raise your hand. So what I want to start with maybe is this European Middle East nexus. You had connected with Stefan's idea to somehow connect these histories, and I would argue, yeah, you can do this on an academic level. I mean, we can sit together and we can talk about it, and we can say this is the European perspective, this is the Middle East perspective, and somehow maybe approach each other. What I wonder is, how do you do this in the cultural sense? I mean, these documentaries, they're for an audience you described, also the European movies or the US American movies about the genocide, also for a special audience. So how is it possible to somehow to connect it? I mean, except in the sense of academic research, you know? I mean, this is what I'm wondering, how to transfer these very interesting insights you have on this memory of culture into a dialogue or discussion or whatever. I mean, this is something I always struggle with. So maybe, I don't know if you have an answer to this or if it's just my personal haunting of this these ideas. So that would be a question.
Yeah, if I can answer directly to this question, because I think it's, of course, an important question. As academics, we are always a little bit, occupied with ourselves and wonder how much of this is going to be heard and influence public discourse. This is, of course, a problem. But here, since I'm indeed investigating public memory, I'm talking about things, and for instance, World War I Through Arab Eyes has received a German adaptation. So from both a point of marketing, we must understand that these discourses are not disconnected anymore. These products, also Al Jazeera as a product, these documentaries are meant for an international market, and they are received worldwide. And that's why I'm, let's say, not so pessimistic about to connect, let's say, and we're always talking about constructions, right? We're talking about the construction of European memory, talking about the construction of an Arab memory of the World War. These are, we are not talking about a reality that is out there that we can grab with both hands, but we can identify in a documentary, just as I tried to do, a kind of attempt to offer an audience a narrative that goes beyond national borders and that creates some kind of pan-Arab sense of identity. This is this is my claim. This is what's happening here. I've shown this also in a book with an art production that is called The 14 Diaries of the Great War, where I compare, in a way, these two documentaries that try to create transnational identities, if you want. So to answer your question, I think we can we can connect these memories with this kind of media because it's already happening. That's my answer in short. It's and I talked about the German adaptation of World War I Through Arab Eyes, which was broadcasted in Phoenix. And now, how many people will have seen that? Right? Not many. And and maybe probably I don't know, maybe nobody in the audience here, which are experts, actually knows about it, right? So we are talking about a very small audience, I must admit, but still it's happening, right? It's happening, and these things are online. You can find them on YouTube, etc. If I may make a remark also about the adaptation, which is interesting, I think. The German adaptation, of course, cut out the remarks about the establishment of Israel, which would have steered the controversy. And this was basically the among other minor changes, the only minor changes that were made in order to broadcast it to a German audience. So you can see that the product, if we look at it from a kind of product and capitalistic point of view, if you want, because you have to sell these products, you can see that the productions are made for international markets. Okay, I close here.
Yeah, but I mean that's true. But I wonder, I mean, how to. I mean, it's not only a question of viewers, of numbers of viewers, but it's also a question of how you somehow transform the ideas of denialism, which come into the cultural, let's say, landscape with these kind of movies, and how to moderate them. I mean, it's a difficult question, I guess, but I think that's the danger I see in this kind of perspective change. But anyway, Michael, there's a question in the chat, and Natasha asks if is cultural trauma the same as intergenerational trauma?
No, it's not. Yeah, I can give a clear answer to that. It's not. Cultural trauma is an approach that, as I mentioned in the beginning, was coined by the cultural sociologist Jeffrey C. Alexanders and others, and it is in the way that it is coined there, it is a social constructivist approach that basically says we do not, the trauma does not come from the event itself, but it comes from the perception of it. Now, I don't agree with this definition of trauma, and I also changed it partly in my research. I modified this approach, but there is a clear difference to what is intergenerational trauma. What if you think of Marianne Hirsch's works of post-trauma, of trauma that really runs to the families and the societies in a more direct way, which remains an important aspect of trauma theory. But we have, it's a different approach. And I, as a scholar, used it actually to explain a little bit the notion of the Holocaust in Germany, because in a German, let's say, perception of the Holocaust is also a trauma in a way, and this is a strange thing because it is certainly not a sense of a trauma in terms of a intergenerational fact that the Germans suffered. The majority of the Germans who were among the perpetrators, but so how can this notion of trauma be attributed to, let's say, the Holocaust? And Jeffrey Alexander's work of cultural trauma shows very well how the notion of trauma is indeed attributed to a historical event from a present-day perspective that has not a direct link to the suffering that was experienced. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I guess this is the difference between, let's say, the perception is a more general approach. So it could be also due media or whatever. So it's not just about the story of the family from family to family, if I understood this correctly. So Michael, we have to go along with our panel. So I'm sorry, but if there are no questions in the audience on the chat, so I would like to thank you for your presentation. And you can stay in the call and watch the rest of the panel, I think, in the waiting room. But they will, the technicians will take care of this. And so thanks again for this presentation. And we will now